Great, Yavolani, you're here. Nice to see you. And hopefully Prudence will also join us.
Hi, Anna,
Yeah,
and
hi.
everyone there. Baju can see there.
Yeah. Just if you can just briefly introduce yourself, so and now the colleagues are, um, yeah, the colleagues are now just filling out a short questionnaire. So if you just like to introduce yourself briefly.
Okay. Uh, I don't know whether shall I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It's late afternoon where I am. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Javulan Makwele from University of Limpopo, Limpopo Province, South Africa. I'm in the Department of Social Work as a lecturer and as the researcher. My areas of interest are climate change and migration. I do research as well on substance use disorders and public health issues. Those are the areas which, in the main, I do research on. Currently, it is a bit cold in South Africa, I know, comparatively to the northern side. It is not as cold as that side, but we are chilling. Yeah, I'm looking forward to active engagement and contribution and views from colleagues across the globe. Yeah, I don't know whether there's more which I need to say, Anna, or
No,
is
that's
that
that's good for the beginning, and then you will have an opportunity to share some of your insights in the short presentation. So we will now start. I would just like to give you some brief introduction into the topic, and my colleagues will also share some of their insights. But of course, I hope that we will have some discussion in between, and I will follow up on your answers that you provided in the questionnaire. So now we'll start with the title itself. So the challenges of community practice in deprived communities. I know that you are not happy with the concept of deprived communities and this name. But when you see the alternatives, they are not much better. So when we take a look across the globe, different names under which we describe this community that have developmental difficulties, there is actually 15 very frequently used names. They are all focusing on problematic side of a community. So if we start from Canada with remote communities, and the same in Australia, when we go to United States, there is commonly used terms like ghetto, low income, impoverished, poor, disadvantaged community. Then we go to South America with favela, vulnerable, marginalized communities. And then in United Kingdom and Ireland, deprived communities and deprived neighborhoods. In European Union, we find less favored, underserved, underprivileged communities. In China, for example, underdeveloped, vulnerable communities. In Southeast Asia, slum, poor communities. In Africa, slum, poor communities, impoverished, vulnerable, marginalized. These are mostly concepts that are defined and measured if you take a look in literature, but there are also some other more illustrative names, but all these names are now placed under the umbrella concept of deprived communities. So as I said, I know that you are probably not happy with any of these names because they all demonstrate some problems that exist with the communities themselves. The reason why I chose the deprived communities and umbrella is three reasons. So the first one is it clearly states that there is some problem with the development or development inequalities. So not a community as a problem, but the inequalities of this development comparing to the surrounding. Deprived community is scientifically recognized term, and if you go throughout the literature, you will find deprived and disadvantaged communities many times actually used. But what differs them is that disadvantaged communities are usually measured through aggregated individual level variables, while deprived communities combine both structural level and aggregated individual level variables. So this is the reason why deprived communities is used here as an umbrella concept for all these communities that we found across the globe as that have some problems, challenges in their development. So based on the very extensive review of definitions, indicators, measurements, and having in mind regional context and scientific context in which these terms are used, from urban planning, local development, sociology, anthropology, many technical disciplines to social work, sociology, psychology. So across different disciplines, the broad community is a community that has one of following features. Many times it has more than one, but at least one is that we can say, okay, this community is deprived in some way and needs some special, let's say, consideration. So first is that there is a significant number of inhabitants that have low socioeconomic status. Second one is that it has some unfavorable developmental outcomes compared to their surroundings. The third one is that it faces structurally conditioned obstacles in its development. The fourth one is that it is exposed to serious destructive risks. So even though now it may not have lower developmental outcomes, but there are some serious risks that are threatening its development in the future. And lastly, it creates an unfavorable existential environment. So not solely with the level of development, but the whole climate inside the community is actually not favorable for its residents. Why we thought that community practice is and could be a specialized field of community practice. So community practice in deprived communities can be seen as a specialized field of community practice for three reasons. The first one is that deprivation of communities is a big social problem. So when we take a look, the number of people that live in slums, in ghettos and favelas across the world, plus all these different features of deprived communities, we can say that approximately 20 to 30, even 30% of global population lives in deprived community. Deprivation of community is a generator of further social inequalities. So when I did quite an extensive research reviews for the research done in last 5 years, there is no doubt that life in deprived communities has very harmful consequences on almost all areas of personal well-being, including physical, mental health, education, economic status, personal development, as well as family and close relationships. So it is a generator of further social inequalities. And lastly, developed and underdeveloped communities, they are not part of the same continuum, and they are not the front and the back of the same coin. So it is not the same concept on the continuum that differs them. Actually, deprived communities is a phenomenon itself because it has very specific internal dynamics and processes, but also the effect of a deprived community is not proportional to the effect of an affluent community. That is very interesting research finding that I came across. It means that the deprived community has stronger but negative influence, while so the community level variables are much more important for people living in deprived communities, while for people living in affluent communities, individual level variables are the ones that have more predictive strengths on their personal well-being. So I would now maybe connect this with one of our plenary sessions today from Dr. Roger Green that says actually we are basically working with deprived poor communities. So when we work with communities, it's many times with the communities that have some issues and have some problems. So for this reason, we published this book and we collected 13 chapters to try to conceptualize what will be the social work practice and the community practice in deprived communities. So the book is published this year in April and May. It's in hard copy by Springer. So we would just like to use this workshop to raise some issues, to open discussion with you and see maybe for some further initiatives that can happen in the future. So there is also, in reviewing all these articles and researches that are done through across the globe, we proposed a sort of a framework that can help us understand the vicious cycle of community deprivation. So, of course, everything has to be considered in the context of structural conditions. So there are some things related to geography, to some crisis that is going on, to some catastrophes, for example, now pandemic. But there are also sometimes these structural conditions, they don't have to be necessarily negative. For example, some new paradigms that are introduced into the society, like digital transformation or green transition, some new paradigms that put some new tasks for the communities. And then we have below, let's say, this structural environment, we have community that has some development processes that has to deal with, has its own institution, capacity, structures, level of attachment of its residents, some archetypes or patterns of behavior that exist within this community. So what causes this vicious cycle of deprivation are some other processes that are going on between these two levels. The first one that we came across very often in the research across the globe, and I can personally witness this with my practice and research experience, is that there's many times surrounding practices power over or uses some forms of exploitation, stigmatization, and unequal opportunities that are forced and actually put a pressure on a community. So many times we find these examples across the globe, from very harmful practices to, let's say, just nurturing unequal opportunities. As a result and as a reaction to this, what happens inside the community is the fact that people that live in community start to fight for limited resources, and there are very vivid power imbalances that usually happen. So what is, for example, when we talk about ghetto community, one of the characteristics of ghetto is that is very much there is a big level of inequalities within the community. So in many deprived communities across the globe, we find a high level of inequalities within the communities themselves, and of course, regional inequalities that are going on between the community and its surrounding. And just to finish up this vicious cycle, as a result of this local response, is the fact that community starts to stigmatize itself. So it starts to reflect itself as a powerlessness and as a one that is socially disorganized. So the whole this position actually reaffirms itself towards wider surrounding. So as a community practitioners, the question is in which part of this cycle we will tackle. So usually we are oriented with our community development projects in this box, but sometimes policies, regional policies are oriented on the first box on structural conditions. But there are not many cases where when we tackle with our practices these other impacts that actually pursue this vicious cycle of deprivation. So just to put this in the context of current pandemic, so we see now as a structural condition pandemic itself, but also measures against the pandemic, lockdown, vaccinations, and others. In the community, we expect adaptation, some kind of adaptation to health risks. We expect local institutions to be flexible in their response. It, of course, depends on the level of their autonomy. We also expect some kind of resilience in the community in a way how they will take advantage of this new normal situation. We also expect communities to be, let's say, to embrace certain level of discipline in keeping the lockdown measures and some others. And of course, to see how the people are used to connect and how can they now connect in different circumstances. But what we also witness in many examples throughout the world is actually that we see some reflections between the structural and local level. So there are digital inequalities, the measures that are reckless towards regional inequalities, towards poverty. We see, for example, delays in vaccination. That is a sort of an archetype how we deal with less developed parts of our planet. We see also examples of corruption in medical, for example, in usage of medical equipment and resources. And as a reaction to this, we see that in the communities there is the deterioration of trust, that inner inequalities are widening, and we see there are winners and losers of the pandemic. So again, as a reflection, we see that some communities are already stigmatized as problematic ones. There are conflicts, riots, embracing conspiracy theories, believe that community has no impact. So this is kind of vulnerability, a vicious cycle of deprivation, just illustrated on this current crisis. And I will stop here. So we also, when we consider many community principles of community development, we also, many of them are listed here. So I will not read them because they are already familiar to you throughout the literature and your practice before. But all these principles are under pressure when we come in this very specific surrounding of the deprived community. So we see one of the pressures comes from oppressive policies and practices against deprived communities that we see many times. For example, in Croatia, many deprived communities are places where government makes a decision to settle harmful waste disposal, like nuclear waste disposal, asbestos waste disposal. This is just one of the examples for these oppressive policies that are practiced outside the community. But there are also oppressive relationships within the community and appearance of social disorganization. So many research findings actually acknowledge that there is social disorganization in deprived communities. Also, reduced social cohesion and insufficient community participation. Many times in deprived communities, it's a very big challenge to motivate citizens to participate, to be involved. So, and Baiju will mention some of his insights with this regard. And of course, there is reduced sense of belonging to community and some kind of negative community experience. And here I would specifically like to stress out that there are special, let's say, challenges for community practitioners that work in these communities. And not only for them as a professional, but also on a personal level. This is why I asked you this question in the questionnaire, and Glenn will also reflect in a way to this. So I will stop now here, and maybe to see just before we jump and before I give the word to Baiju, that will specifically talk about the challenges of citizens' participation in deprived communities with regard to Indian poor communities and Gandhian heritage. I would just now stop sharing the screen and see if just to reflect now briefly in your response, and if there is a question at this point. Okay, so it seems like there are no questions so far. Then just would like to see out of your response, a majority of you said that you are working with deprived or challenging local communities. So 7 out of 10 of you. And it mostly is that there is a significant number of inhabitants that have low socioeconomic status, that developmental outcomes are unfavorable compared to the surroundings, and that the community faces some structurally conditioned obstacles in its development. So this is now where you stand, and we will see further on some other topics. Baiju, you are the next, and just if you can get the permission to share the screen.
I've just granted that now.
Yeah, great.
Okay, hello everyone. Uh, Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my experiences and insights on community engagement in Indian context. I'm quite conscious that I'm not able to represent for all the non-governmental as well as government programs in India. But I'll be sharing from my experience of community work as well as my research in that field. I have a small presentation. So let me start with saying that India has a huge population, something that many people in other parts of the world cannot actually understand in its fullest context. And it's also very diverse in nature, in the culture, in the socioeconomic context, and several socioeconomic contexts which is different from other parts of the world. So along with government, India has a federal government system with the central government and the state governments, as well as all the line of administration below that one. There are n number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations working in the nook and corner of the country. It includes international organizations and mostly local community-based organizations. Government of India, India became an independent country in 1947, and the official community development project in India was launched in 1952. The hereditary or the legacy of community work in India comes from the freedom movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. Then many of the non-governmental organizations were started on the ideals of Gandhian principles. The approaches, including the participatory approaches in community work, actually came in 1970s, along with all those community engagement and people's movements in other parts of the world. And the new ideas of community engagement, which was mostly known as kind of participatory approaches, were introduced by the international donor agencies as well as international development agencies. I wanted to talk about two sectors of players in community engagement. One is the non-governmental sector and the other is government sector. So I have just one slide each for all those sectors due to the time limit. So the way I define community engagement is an active and informed involvement of all stakeholders, mostly the members of the benefiting community in planning, implementing, monitoring, evaluation of policies and programs which affect their life. So there are different methodologies adopted and used in the community engagement process by NGOs. It was in early 1980s, the concept of participatory rural appraisal, which was, earlier called as a rapid rural appraisal, was introduced. And PRA is one of the methods used by several non-governmental organizations. So from 1990 to 2022, even the present period, the various ways of using it or the various tools of using it has been massively used by the non-governmental organizations. So it includes participatory rural appraisal methods, participatory monitoring and evaluation, participatory technology development, participatory mapping, social mapping. All those methods have been used. They have been used not only in the planning phases, but in the implementing phases as well as the monitoring and evaluation phases. There are different forms of community engagement coming up in representative democracy, not only in the non-profit sector, but in the government as well. And social media also have been used of late in the engagement process, which actually brings in lots of accountability and transparency in the activities of the government as well as of the NGOs. There are different models of community engagement, community co-production implemented by government, non-NGOs in India, which is available in various literature. But I wanted to focus on more on the government initiative, which is not much discussed in the global literature. This is the local self-government initiative in India. So there was a Panchayati Raj Act introduced in 1993. So this brings in a line of multiple levels of local self-government, both in rural as well as in urban areas. This is based on the Mahatma Gandhi's concept of Gram Swaraj, which simply means a self-reliant village. I mean, this is not the typical of what Mahatma Gandhi propounded, but in practice, this is very close to what Gandhiji proposed. So there are governance at 3 levels of local self-government. So from every state has its own administrative districts. And at the bottom level is the panchayat, which consists of 5,000 to 20,000 people. Then the next level is a body that represents all these panchayats. It comes to 5 to 7 panchayats. And there is the upper level at the district level, which is again all those panchayats and block panchayats in one district is governed by them. And the bottom level is the Grama Sabha, which is the ward level or local community groups. And the decisions typically should come from that community meeting. Say, for example, a panchayat has a housing scheme and it has 100 houses. It is going to support 100 houses. So who should benefit from this housing scheme? And the decision has to be taken by the Grama Sabha, which is a representative body of the people. Not actually a representative body, but the whole adult people come there. Typically, ideally, they sit together, they discuss, and they make a decision who should benefit from this housing scheme. And people have the choices to make a decision. Well, if you ask me, effectively, does it happen always? May not be. There will be some other factors coming. But this is the representative democratic form of it. And you know, there is 33% of reservation for women in all the leadership. And some of the states, there are 50% of reservation for women in the leadership of it, which means like every panchayat will have alternatively a woman president, a woman member representing them, and every alternate years. And that is a massive change that happened. And that is a form of established form of community engagement, where it addresses the needs of the deprived communities in the whole context. I have 2 pictures. This is one picture. Well, if this person resembles me, it is me. Yeah, I was doing this PRA workshop. This is me doing a workshop way back in 15 years back when I was working in a community-based drinking water supply project, drinking water supply and sanitation project. So we are using some of the tools where people come together and they monitor the contribution of the community in that one. This picture is something common that you can find if you go for Google. This is a picture of a Grama Sabha, which is the local community sitting together to make decision of their community in the government system. I wanted to introduce one case study, which is part of the chapter that I have written in the book. So this was done by an agency by name Center for Rural Development. This is in South India. So they were assigned to do some community development initiatives in an indigenous community. That indigenous community has some of the lowest development indicators in the province, in the state. So what they do was they did some kind of discussion with the herds of the elders within the indigenous community, and they prepared the development plan with the community. So they stayed in the community, they listened to the people, they did several rounds of discussion, they used some tools of PRA, where there was a kind of ensured participation of the community, and then they developed the plan for local development. So what do you need? What should be the focus of it? What should be the strategies? What are the resources available? And because some of the government efforts have happened there, the community was not very receptive in the beginning, because government initiatives are not very successful in many cases. So the community was not receptive in the beginning. But later, the agency people were in a kind of understanding the situation of the community. They stayed with them, and they worked with in tandem with the local self-government. So they were not working in isolation, but they worked with the local panchayat, the government institutions, the local bank. They mobilized resources from the local bank. They got finance from the local bank. So a networking with all the community resources as well as the government agencies was done. And what happened was that, there was a huge improvement in the agriculture produce, which actually helped for better livelihood for the members of indigenous communities. So the latest stage, they were saying they were thinking about registering a company, a producer's company, so that they could export their producers and get better pay for their producers. So this is the context of community engagement for deprived communities, but of course there are several challenges involved in it. So there was several studies done, like World Bank. The World Bank was one of the pioneers in promoting participatory practices, but it also became critical about it at some stages. And they find that even when we say about community itself is a kind of abstract notion, because it is often represented by people who are able or elite or respected, or people who are opinion leaders in the community. Government systems are often vulnerable to corruption, inefficiency, all those bureaucratic process, and it is true. When we say decentralization of planning in government in India through Panchayat Raj, and the critics say it is also decentralization of corruption, and that is true in some way. Non-profit sector suffers from lots of inadequacies, the technological thing, paucity of funds, issues with the competency of staff and everything. And tokenism is also developing, which means like, you do things just for the sake of it. That the spirit of participation is not taken into consideration. So, okay, let us do PRA, let us do some methods of involving people, but that is done for the sake of the report. It essentially may not be happening. So, yeah, so those are the kind of challenges that is happening. Yeah, so these are all kind of my experiences of my PhD was also in the on how do we engage, how do NGOs engage beneficiaries as well as stakeholders in the development process. So these are my experiences from the observations from the field as well. These are some of the references. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I would be able ready to contribute to the discussion as well as answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Baiju, very much. I suggest now that we proceed with Yapulani, who also raised how, let's say, some indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and practices can serve to development of poor African communities. So are you here with, yeah, I see he's here, but just, probably he will now join us in a minute, because now we're reflecting on what you, Baiju, said, some of your response about the challenges, what is challenging for you as a practitioner in a community, and in the community that can be considered deprived, is actually, some of you did mention this, in issues of inclusivity and involving community members in issues that are affecting them. So yeah, I think that now we have these practices that we can learn from, that are very genuine for the community. So Yapulani, once again, are you here with us? No, he's not.
Hello.
Yeah.
I think my colleague Prudence will be the one to present.
Okay. If you
she's here in the meeting.
Yes.
And then both of us who will be presenting. Shall I present? I mean, oops.
Okay. Your camera is off.
Yes, I want to put it on.
Prof, I think you also need to ask for permission to share your screen.
Okay, now the Anna will give you permission. But please be in 10 minutes, not 15, 10. because we were a little bit late with the beginning, and I want also Glenn to share his insights from Canada.
Okay.
Okay, let me quickly start, Prof, when you are ready to project, because I don't think we'll have enough time to present all of what we have prepared. But
Okay.
we'll
Can I
see
request
where that
Anna
takes us.
to project it for us?
You should have screen sharing access now.
Let me see.
I've made you co-host, so you should have.
Excuse me, do you see on the bottom of your panel green button, share screen named?
Yes.
So you need on your computer open your presentation, first of
Good.
all. Do you have it?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Just a minute.
Okay. You need to open it first.
It's opened.
Yes, then a share screen. Please push the button.
Okay, good.
Mhm. So great.
Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
good.
it visible. Thank you.
Let me hand over to my colleague Prudence.
Okay, thank you. And greetings, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Prudence Mafa from University of Limpopo in South Africa, and mine and my co-presenters topic is from chapter 8 of the book that Anna spoke about earlier. And the title of the chapter is Enhancing Poverty Reduction through Community Work in Low Resource Areas in Africa. So the presentation will simply be focused on 3 items. Firstly, we'll talk about the use of Ubuntu as a philosophy in community development, and then we'll also give a snippet of Ubuntu values that are crucial in community engagement, as well as look at positive outcomes associated with the use of Ubuntu when working with deprived communities. Ubuntu as a philosophy of development. We all know that humanism is the core of social work as a profession. This is shown in how universal social work values and principles are anchored on this important concept of human interaction. Way before caring and helping professional careers were established, such as social work and nursing, people have been able to identify and seek solutions for their own challenges, as well as taking care of the vulnerable members of their communities. So working with deprived community members as a professional does not mean that you are the expert who comes into the communities with smart and ready-made solutions. And it is from this premise that people's own way of addressing calamities need to be infused with the professional know-how of social workers or community practitioners. For a long time, social workers have been planning and implementing community projects that are aimed at addressing or eradicating poverty using the bottom-up approach, which entails that community members need to be placed at the center of community projects, and they have to get involved in all engagement processes. So as with social work values, Ubuntu emphasizes the need for mutual respect among people. It entails values such as group solidarity, compassion, respect, human dignity, conformity to basic forms, as well as a collective unity. So in essence, Ubuntu means humanity and morality. Although some authors have indicated that Ubuntu is difficult to explain in English, an author by the name of Lefa defines it as the act of being human, caring, sympathy, forgiveness, or any values of humaneness towards others. So Ubuntu also implies that one can only increase their own good fortune by sharing with other members of society, and thereby also enhancing their status within the community. From these definitions of what Ubuntu is, we can see that the emphasis is on communalism rather than individualism, where the former is an important feature of rural development. Continue, Prof, your way too far. So Ubuntu has been a way of life for most African people. And one author emphasizes that Umuntu Ubuntu Gabat, which simply means I am because we are. So various community self-help groups have been initiated based on this viewpoint, which is an indication that mutual aid still exists among Africans. And examples of such groups are highlighted in the book chapter, which you can get online. So the rationale behind the inclusion of culture or Ubuntu in development is that collectivity, reciprocity, spirituality, and interconnectedness are important values in African cultures. And as I alluded on before, the emphasis is on individual persons acting together in a collective manner in order to achieve a common goals. This means that culture does still have a place in the lives of African people, although this is still a debatable topic because others might disagree. So it is important that African people seek the strength in the foundation of their indigenous cultures if they are to cope with modern challenges. So, Prof, we're going to move on to the various initiatives that were founded on the philosophy of Ubuntu. Like I said before, across the African continent, various groups have been formed in order to meet certain needs of their members. These several arrangements for community work existed even before pre-colonial Africa, and some of them still exist today. So examples of such initiatives that are also discussed in the chapter are Zima in South Africa, Nimbe, Umganda, Harambe, as well as Ujama. And this list is not exhaustive of all the initiatives that were formed in the spirit of Ubuntu in deprived communities. We can also speak of Bingo Silver Grey Foundation in Malawi that was aimed at taking care of the elderly, and many other initiatives such as this across the continent. So you can also feel free to use the comment section to write about other initiatives in your own communities that were founded on the spirit of Ubuntu, the philosophy of Ubuntu, because a platform such as this conference was created for us to share knowledge, which will allow us to get a glimpse of what is happening across the world. So when we talk of Tima or Lijima, we speak of a communal or cooperative work. Lijima simply means many people in Sipedi. This is a system where community members come together and help each other without expecting anything in return. In the days gone by, Lijima was mostly used during the plowing, weeding, and harvesting seasons. Community members will take turns carrying out these activities on each other's land. And unfortunately, because many Africans were dispossessed of their land, that has dwindled, but still continues in other ways. And we can still see the principle of Lijima being applied when one member of the community has a ceremonial event or has to prepare for a loved one's funeral, where community members still come and lend a helping hand with the expectation that their deed would be reciprocated. So this concept can still be used in professionalized social work. And Lijima is anchored on the philosophy of Ubuntu and it encourages cooperative effort and a collective commitment in improving the lives of both individuals as well as improving the society at large. In Zimbabwe, Prof, you can change the slide. In Zimbabwe, there is Zunde Ramambo, which is a communal method of growing and storing grain together to be used by disadvantaged members of society. So the stored grain would usually be used to feed the elderly, orphans, and people with disabilities. This kind of practice shows how indigenous people were charitable, and it ensured that the most vulnerable members of the community were taken care of. We can see that this was impressive given that it was done without external assistance from any overseas philanthropists or organizations. So unfortunately, due to the social and political circumstances in that country, the Zundera Mabu has been discontinued, and it would be nice to have it revived. And as you all know, the situation in Zimbabwe, that might take decades. So moving on to Rwanda, there is Umganda, which simply means community work. And it is used to get people together to solve their social and economic problems for mutual benefit. It's a compulsory practice which takes place on the last Saturday of each month, and it was initiated by the Rwandan government after the genocide. So given that this is a mandatory practice, failure to participate as an able-bodied can see you pay a fine or even get arrested. So this one way of instilling responsibility among African citizens so that they take responsibility for their own cities. In East Africa, in Tanzania, we also have Umjama, which also means family, food, or traditional kinship. This concept was popularized by Julius Nyerere because he wanted to move people from the cities back to the villages using a concept called visualization. He wanted people to go back to their own towns or own villages and make them become economic hubs where the government would give them economic and material support for group farming. Although this Umjama did not yield Nyerere's desired results. In South Africa, we can see a similar trend growing because down here, some middle-income income earners are beginning to secure land in rural areas for the purposes of both sustenance and commercial farming on a small to medium scale. So as community developers, as social workers, as community workers, if we are to use these plots or small pieces of land as community development opportunities and get the government involved and help these small farmers to acquire material and monetary assistance, these pieces of land can actually help in reducing unemployment rate as cities have become saturated and present even less opportunities for work than they did before.
We have
We also
just 1 minute, so please wrap up because we have not enough time, and I would like just Glenn to share his thoughts.
Okay, I'll then quickly move to the outcomes of using the Ubuntu philosophy as a concept in community development. And those are recognition of strength, people who have a positive outlook on life and they will have reduced apathy. There's also opportunity for women empowerment. So, Prof, I'll just hand over to you so that you can wrap up. Unfortunately, we ran out of time.
Thank you very
Over to
much. Thank you very much, Ms. Mafa. With regard to Ubuntu as a philosophy, it cut across various spheres of human life. In terms of crime prevention, is one of the area where the philosophy of Ubuntu is applied. In terms of food production, Ms. Mafa has made reference to in education, in housing or construction of houses. This philosophy has been seen in practice where people come together to construct a house for a particular family, and then from there, as she has indicated, it is reciprocal. They move to the next household and build a house there. So in Africa, in South Africa in particular, the philosophy of Ubuntu is seen practically. Africans are gregarious in nature. We work together for the benefit of the welfare of the community. Am I still having more time? I can speak till
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time is running out, but I will really like Glenn now to join us because he has his experience from remote Canada. But while Glenn is sharing his screen, and probably, hopefully he's here. Yes, he's here. So just if you can now click stop sharing so that Glenn can pop in. And while he's doing this, you mentioned, and Baiju mentioned here, that how the institutionalization of citizen participation can actually be working against the genuine participation that already existed in the community. And I think it's really important thing to note, because I noticed the same thing in Croatia on another part of the world. So yeah. Okay, Glenn, now if you can join with your presentation, and hopefully now just you have to, yes, now we have screen.
Okay. You can see the presentation okay?
Not yet, no. Did you click screen share before you went into your presentation?
Yeah. Have you got it now?
No, I can't see it, Glenn.
Oh. Okay. I'll put it away, screen share, and
Would you want me to maybe start your presentation?
if you've got it there, yeah,
I have it.
not sure why it's not coming up.
Yeah, is it here?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just move through very quickly. We don't have much time. So second slide, please. Yeah, I just thought I'd throw this map up there. In the introduction, Anna mentioned that the term remote is often used in Canada. We also use the word north, and it's often used in a pejorative sense. The settlers in New France referred to it as le pays en haut, that land up there. Go to the next slide, please. As a map of contemporary Canada. I practiced in northern Manitoba. I've also practiced in northern British Columbia. Next slide, please. One of the factors working in northern Canada has to do with physical isolation when you're talking about any kind of practice, whether it's social development, community development work, casework, whatever it might be. There are many isolated communities. So in northern Manitoba, where I worked, for example, there were probably about 20 communities that were only accessible during the winter. Otherwise, you had to fly in. Now, you can imagine the cost of bringing in things like fuel, construction materials, things of that nature. often along very precarious winter roads. With climate change, the season for moving goods and services into communities is becoming increasingly short. Next slide, please. Next, some communities are only air accessible and may not have all-weather airstrips, so it means landing on water in summer, landing on ice in the winter. Next slide, please. The relationship between remote communities in Canada and urban centers can sometimes be described as a hinterland metropolis relationship. There are some mutual benefits, but it's often very exploitative. A lot of the remote communities in Canada are based on resource extraction, and that resource extraction can be very temporary and often involves some seasonal work. And there's a great deal of dependency on the urban community. And the same is true of health and social services. Next slide, please. A lot of communities, as I said, are very temporary. This is a photo of Cassiar, British Columbia. This was an asbestos mining community. And when asbestos was found to be very dangerous, this community shut down and all of the workers lost their jobs and had to move. Next slide, please. Indigenous communities in the north are very isolated and very poor. Quality of housing is poor. Access to fresh potable water is not good. Next slide, please. One of the things about the social worker or the community development worker is that if you're working in a large urban center, you can often create some space, some separation, whether it's psychological separation or even physical separation between yourself and the community. In a small community like this tiny isolated fly-in community along the BC coast, when you're in the community, you can't move to another neighborhood, you can't spend time away, so you're constantly immersed within the community. Next slide, please. So some of these things create personal factors for social workers. High visibility, high accessibility. People can contact you at any hour of the day, anytime. You have elevated community status. There are things like multiple relationships that you have to deal with. Your practice may be intensely scrutinized at times. There's increased responsibility and often isolation from peers. Next slide, please. So social work is a profession. As a profession, factors like boundaries and roles are important to consider. I was very interested in Sarah Banks' presentation the other day. She showed a different framework for making ethical decisions. But some of the ethical codes, ethical procedures are developed in urban centers and don't always make a lot of sense in small isolated communities. Next slide, please. One of the things about social workers in Northern Canada is that many of them are employed directly by government or government-funded agencies. This can create tension because the work of miners or forestry workers may not be as secure as government workers. In terms of Indigenous communities, there's a whole legacy of residential school and child welfare practices which have created mistrust. And the educated social worker is regarded as an outsider. Next slide, please. And I'll quickly finish with strategies. I think as social workers, we have to be prepared to listen and avoid taking on the mantle of expert. We need to develop an awareness of the history and personal politics within the community. We need to know how the profession is generally regarded in the community. We have to respect local knowledge and be effective facilitators. As a new social worker in a community, you have to proceed with caution in order to avoid pitfalls and loss of credibility. Next slide, please. And social workers need to learn how to work with other disciplines because multidisciplinary practice in small isolated communities with few resources is certainly one avenue. We need to know how to work with natural helpers, Indigenous elders, Indigenous healers, people of that nature. And social workers need to see the community as a rich source of resources rather than a desert that's resource deprived. So I'm done. I'm sorry to go so quickly, but we didn't have much time. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We really ran over some of our presentation, but actually what we would like maybe to get in the future, maybe some more separate space or area to go more into deep and to connect with practitioners that work in challenging environments. So perhaps through International Association of Community Development, or maybe some other forms, just to raise this topic and maybe to go more in details, because I really believe that the community practice in deprived communities needs some special attention given to it. So now, if we will have. I noticed that in your response, you also reflected on some issues that are for you personally and professionally challenging in challenging communities. For example, frustration with slow change, too many barriers, makes me question what real change I can actually make with the local political context. Motivation to raise awareness regarding structural causes of poverty, reflect carefully and ethically what's desirable and possible, ensure inclusivity. So all these challenges are really more visible in deprived communities. And I would say that in deprived communities, community practice really tests itself in so many different ways. So now I don't want to take any minute of your break, but if you want some reaction to some response, some thoughts on our presenters, and if you have an energy to spend maybe a few minutes extra here, I invite you now maybe to share the audience if you would like to share something else. There are also some reactions in the chat, and not some, but many, but thank you for that. Well, Sarah, yes, please.
Thank you for some absolutely fascinating and inspiring presentations. Such very diverse contexts, but obviously what you're finding in common is this idea of people living in communities that are classed as deprived. And I was wondering, as a group, what you feel you've learned from each other, you know, from actually doing these chapters for the book, which are bringing so many different perspectives. And if there is any joint learning, which maybe you will be putting in the introduction to the book, that you've gathered through this international project.
Yes, I don't know, maybe perhaps colleagues, if you would like to give your response to this, Baiju or Glenn. Or...
Well, I think one thing that is probably obvious from the presentation is that there isn't a cookie cutter approach to community development, that it is very much based in context. I think we had a flavor of that today with Baiju's presentation, the presentations from South Africa and Zimbabwe. There are different contexts, different local sensibilities, and sort of having a sort of grand theory of community development, I'm not sure really works, because it's very, very localized in many respects. And when I did work within single industry resource towns versus work within indigenous communities, I had to take very different approaches in each case. And that's even within the same country. And within the same geographic sphere. So I think that's something that we learned in doing this book, that there are multiple approaches, multiple ways of doing community development. And what's really important is to have a sense of what some of the local issues, local considerations might be.
Okay, we have one request from Anna to turn our cameras on, just for the workshop photo.
That's just while the conversation might be carrying on, but if the cameras are on, then we can take the photograph anyway.
Okay. Perhaps if there is another question following on Sarah's question, or if not, maybe Baiju and Jabulani can also reply to that one.
Are you ready, dear participants? Excuse me. We need to take a memory photo. Please wave your hands, clap, smile, so on.
Okay, great. Okay, if there are no any additional question, maybe then Baiju and Yabulani, if you would like to wrap up, and Prudence, but Prudence has some connection problems.
Yeah, I tend to agree with what Glenn and Anna said about there is no one cookie cutter format for community work. And I wanted to borrow the word from Glenn. He said, like, local sensibilities. One common approach or element which is unique and universal is the context of power in every community. And the approach that we receive, perhaps I'm a person who follows some kind of critical lenses in analyzing community power. And power relationship is one key thing. And the community work has to be transformative, but the strategies for intervention and work should be very much localized, because like for a very diverse country like in India, where I have lots of experience of working with the different communities, like every, say, 200 kilometers, you find a different recipe, find a different language, or different clothing style. Cultural sensibility and cultural adaptability and cultural competence is a key thing. And interestingly, all those diversity is also connected to the power dynamics in the community. So that's such a kind of sensibility is very, very significant when working with communities. And I also like the point of Ubuntu that was shared by other presenters, where we could find some common threads of connecting with the communities, even though the local context would be different. Thank you.
And yeah, Moses, you have.
Yeah, I just wanted to alert ourselves that our time is up. We have exceeded by 7 minutes. I don't know whether we still have more energy to continue.
I think we are good to go and leave you on a break. And if only, Yabulani, would you like just to finish with your line? And I wish you, and I'm grateful that you all attended and that you were interested in participation. Yes, Yabulani, please.
Thank you for this opportunity. I want to re-emphasize what my other colleagues have indicated. In terms of community development, as social workers or professionals from other disciplines, we need to be, the issue of context come to the fore, and the sensitivity in terms of the diversities which we find at the lower level, in terms of the language, in terms of the practices, in terms of the values. We need to take that into cognizance when we do community development in deprived communities in particular. So we should not find ourselves imposing our own views and own values over and above what the community already has. I think on that note, I want to appreciate and thank everybody for coming on board, sharing. I've loved everything from Glenn, from Baiju, and everybody who has contributed to this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience, all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great conversations. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you, everybody. We want to appreciate your coming for this workshop from Kenya. May you have a good day, good evening, and others, good morning. We welcome you to the next session. We have another session starting at around 30 minutes, where we shall have culture, youth, and youth forums. And also tomorrow, we are here to wrap up this conference. So on behalf of the Kenyan team, we say thank you for your participation, for those wonderful presentations. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna, and the others. God bless you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.